At 0622, on the morning of October 14th, 1943, 19-year-old Sergeant Lou Halperin stood in the waist compartment of B-17F 4230371, watching the world smear into a frozen blur beyond the open gun window. 25,000 feet over Germany was supposed to feel like thin air and sunlight. But today it felt like the inside of a steel drum being shaken by giants. Oxygen masks frosting, aluminum skin groaning, the wind punching through every seam in the fuselage like a living thing. Below him, far beneath the jagged horizon, the factories of Schweinfurt were still black shapes in the dawn haze, waiting for the bombers to come closer. Nobody in the formation said it out loud, but every man knew the truth. This raid would be a slaughter. Lou's gloves trembled on the grips of his 50 cal waist gun. Sweat had nowhere to go inside the freezing mask. It just clung to his skin, turned cold, and made him feel younger than he already was. 19. Too young for the crew he barely knew. Too inexperienced for the briefing he barely understood. Too green for a sky that demanded instinct instead of thought. 2 weeks ago, he had never flown higher than a cornfield windmill. Now he was at 25,000 feet with a gun that could chew through metal like a bandsaw, and a life expectancy measured in missions with numbers smaller than his age. Shell casings rattled under his boots from the crew that had flown this plane yesterday, empty brass cylinders that had rolled back and forth through turbulence, clinking against the ribs of the fuselage like restless ghosts. In the narrow walkway, the radio operator muttered to himself while adjusting the long, trailing antenna. Up front, the pilots fought the turbulence with short, sharp corrections. Somewhere behind Lou, the tail gunner shouted, "Contrails! 12, maybe more!" But the wind swallowed half his words before they reached anyone else. Lou leaned toward the open window. The cold stabbed his cheek instantly. He saw them. Thin white spears piercing the sky on the starboard side. High at first, then dipping, converging, hunting. German fighters, Messerschmitts, closing in fast. Their contrails carved clean lines across the blue like chalk marks across a blackboard. Nothing in training had prepared Lou for how fast they moved, how deliberately they angled in, how much the human mind resisted believing those dots could be death at 400 miles per hour. This was his first mission. And already it was too much, too loud, too bright, too cold, too fast. He'd memorized procedures. Short bursts only, keep barrels cool, never cross into another gunner's arc. He'd repeated the doctrine like a prayer. Stay disciplined, conserve ammo, trust the formation. But as the BF-109s arced downward into position, Lou realized something the manuals had never warned him about. The sky itself felt alive, hostile, predatory, and he felt very, very alone inside it. The intercom crackled. "Fighters inbound, right side, high, hold fire till they commit." Hold fire. Wait, let the veterans shoot. That was the rule. The unspoken one was simpler. Rookies didn't shoot first. Rookies watched, learned, and prayed they didn't freeze when the moment came. But Lou's hands were already tightening on the gun grips, not because he was brave, not because he was ready, because every instinct in him screamed that the sky didn't care about rules and the fighters diving toward him didn't care about experience. He had seconds, maybe less, before the entire right side of the formation erupted in fire. He thought staying still would keep him alive. He believed sticking to the manual would save the crew. He believed discipline was the only thing separating a rookie from a dead man. He was wrong. In 3 minutes, a mistake he hadn't even made yet would change air warfare forever. At 0629 on October 14, 1943, as the bomber stream droned eastward like an endless procession of metal islands floating through hostile sky, Louis Halperin's world narrowed to the space between his gloved fingers and the twin barrels of his 50 cal waist gun. His training instructors were not up here. The diagrams on the chalkboard were not up here. The neat doctrine about arcs and sectors and fire discipline was not up here. But the rules they had branded into his brain were. and they marched through his thoughts with the same rigid certainty as any parade ground formation. Rule 1. Rookie gunners don't take initiative, they follow. Rule 2. Never swing your gun into another man's field of fire. Rule 3. Short bursts only, never walk fire across the formation. The underlying assumption, never written but always understood, was simple and cruel. Rookies are liabilities. They were told this indirectly, in the way sergeants looked at them, in the way instructors said "you people" when talking about first-tour crews. Experienced men survived because they were disciplined. New men died because they panicked. Every lesson, every anecdote, every whispered horror story from the barracks reinforced the same belief, that the safest rookie was the quiet one who did what he was told and nothing more. Lou had heard it during gunnery school on the Texas ranges, where the heat shimmered above the 50 cal barrels, and the targets were politely slow-moving cloth sleeves, towed behind friendly planes. One instructor, a heavy-set staff sergeant with oil-stained hands and a stare like a drill bit, had paced in front of the class and said, paraphrased, "New gunners don't shoot first. You leave that to the men who know what they're doing. A rookie's job is to keep his head down and his finger off the trigger until he's told otherwise." The class had laughed nervously. Lou hadn't. He wrote it in his notebook like scripture. Behind that instruction lurked an older fear: friendly fire, crossed arcs, gunners hosing the sky blindly, hitting their own formation instead of the enemy. The manual didn't trust adrenaline. The system didn't trust instinct. It trusted geometry and discipline. Waist gunners were assigned sectors like slices of a pie, invisible wedges of sky they were told never to abandon. Leave your slice, they were warned, and you might cut someone else's aircraft in half. Somewhere in England, a training officer said, paraphrased, "The safest pattern is the one we've already tested. Don't improvise in the air." But the Luftwaffe had not signed the manual. German pilots were not obligated to attack from convenient angles. They had studied the bomber formations too, and by mid-1943, their doctrine had evolved faster than the Allies' defensive patterns. They came from head-on now, in disciplined packs that sliced straight into the nose of the combat box where overlapping arcs were weakest. They slashed in from oblique angles that tested coordination. They found the seams between sectors, the places where one gunner's do-not-fire boundary met another's hesitation. Those seams were killing bombers at a rate the manuals hadn't predicted. Lou knew none of this in numbers, only in rumors. He had heard older gunners mutter about frontal attacks, about Jerry's coming right down the throat, and about how the old training films didn't match what the 8th Air Force was facing now. Yet the culture held. Rookies didn't talk tactics. Rookies didn't question doctrine. Rookies kept their arcs and their fear to themselves. He had boarded the B-17 believing survival meant obedience to that system. That if he did exactly what he was told, no more, no less, the veterans would keep him alive through his first mission, maybe his second, maybe long enough for his own nerves to harden. He believed that the worst sin he could commit was to swing his guns where they were not supposed to go. In less than an hour, the sky over Schweinfurt would prove the exact opposite. It would show that the real danger wasn't rookies with too much initiative. It was doctrines too slow to keep up with reality. And when that moment came, when fighters cut through the formation at angles nobody had rehearsed on a chalkboard, it wouldn't be the well-trained reflex that saved Lou's crew. It would be the mistake that broke every rule he'd been given. The manuals had prepared him for yesterday's war. Today, by accident, he was about to fire the first shot of tomorrow's. At 0641 on October 14, 1943, while the bomber stream pushed deeper into Bavarian airspace and the cold tightened around the fuselage like a clamp, Louis Halperin gripped his waist gun without realizing he was standing inside a decades-long industrial story. His weapon, his position, the very metal around him, all of it had evolved through a frantic race of production lines, engineering shortcuts, and doctrine debates that none of the 19-year-old rookies in the 8th Air Force had ever been told in full. The B-17 had begun life in the mid-1930s as a high-altitude, long-range bomber with elegant lines and limited gun positions. Nobody then imagined it would become a flying porcupine bristling with 13 50 caliber Brownings. The early versions had fewer guns, fewer mounts, fewer ways to cover the blind spots that German fighters would eventually exploit. But by 1942, the air war over Europe forced an evolution. Engineers at Boeing, Douglas, and Vega burned through blueprints like ammunition, revising, reinforcing, and retooling at a pace the industry had never seen. Gun manufacturers joined the race. The Browning M2 didn't simply appear in the waste windows. It came out of an industrial pipeline stretching from Colt's tooling rooms to large Midwest factories repurposed from peacetime machinery shops. Every single waste gun on a B-17 was the last link in a chain forged by thousands of machinists, metalworkers, welders, and test technicians. At peak speed, American factories were producing 1,200 M2s per day, a rate that stunned even military planners. When the 8th Air Force began losing bombers in 1943, Washington didn't send speeches, it sent more guns. But the guns were only half of the equation. The firing arcs were the other. The waist positions on the B-17F were originally opposite each other, wide open to the slipstream. The airflow made the guns difficult to swing. The cold made the metal seize, and gunners had to stand in freezing hurricane-force winds. Engineers tested enclosed waist windows, staggered windows, even flexible mounting brackets. Bendix and Sperry, companies that specialized in motorized turrets, studied airflow models and ammunition belt feed angles. They tried to map every possible attack vector the Luftwaffe might use. And they guessed wrong in one critical place. Most American planners assumed German fighters would continue their earlier 1942 pattern of attacking from the rear quarter, where they had space and time to dodge return fire. Factories responded by improving the tail guns, strengthening the dorsal turret, and widening coverage aft. The waist guns were meant to protect those arcs, not define them. Meanwhile, early gunnery schools still treated frontal attacks as unlikely, even when reconnaissance reports and fragmented combat footage hinted otherwise. It wasn't just doctrine, it was math. Head-on attacks were suicidal on paper. A fighter closing at nearly 600 mph combined speed had only seconds to fire before colliding. Allied analysts assumed the Germans wouldn't attempt them at scale. Then came the reality of 1943, attrition. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than it could train replacements. Head-on slashes became the tactic of necessity. Deadly, fast, demoralizing. The firing arcs designed for older patterns suddenly left thin, fragile gaps in the bomber formation, and the waist guns, thought secondary, became critical defensive linchpins. But the rookie gunners did not know this industrial and doctrinal scramble. Lou certainly didn't. His training was based on outdated films recorded in New Mexico heat, with friendly aircraft towing cloth sleeves at 120 mph. He practiced turning cranks, memorizing arcs, keeping bursts short to avoid barrel overheat. Yet he never trained for the reality now glinting into view. Dozens of fighters descending from the sun in coordinated, slashing angles no chalkboard had ever drawn. Even the Browning mounts themselves, robust, brilliantly simple, had a secret that mattered now. Their dispersion pattern widened during sustained fire, creating overlapping cones that could form lethal intersections if two guns happened to cross angles at the right moment. Factories didn't design that. Doctrine didn't encourage it. But physics allowed it. And in the next minutes, Lou Halperin, the 19-year-old rookie who barely knew how to steady his breathing at altitude, would swing his gun into a forbidden angle born not from training, but from instinct. He would create purely by accident the first practical demonstration of a defensive pattern the engineers had never taught, and the manuals never imagined. The waist gun he held was a child of industry. The tactic he was about to invent was a child of desperation. Together they would rewrite a small but vital piece of WW2 air combat. At 0655 on October 14, 1943, as the bomber formation crossed into the outer ring of Schweinfurt's defenses, the sky hardened into something mathematical, cold, unforgiving, numeric. Every gunner who survived multiple missions said the same thing in one form or another. The air war wasn't about courage. It was about numbers, altitude, closing speeds, reaction time, ammunition count, fighter density, survival curves. And up here, in the thin, frozen air where the sunlight cut like a blade, numbers didn't just matter. They ruled. Lou Halperin didn't know the statistics by heart, but he had heard enough from older gunners to feel them looming behind every vibration of the fuselage. Start with the rookie life expectancy. Officially, the Army Air Forces said a gunner's odds improved after 10 missions. Unofficially, crews whispered the real figure. Rookies died most often on missions 1 through 5. The survival curve dipped so sharply on first contact with enemy fighters that some waste gunners never fired a single burst before being killed. Lou was 19, and on mission 1. The math did not favor him. Then the loss rate, the number everyone feared. In the worst months of 1943, bomber losses sometimes reached 20% per raid, meaning 1 in 5 aircraft simply didn't come home. A B-17 carried 10 men. That meant 2 men killed or missing for every bomber dispatched on average. More on nightmare days like this one. Schweinfurt was notorious. The first raid had cost more bombers than any single day of the war for the 8th Air Force. Today would be worse. Next came the fighters. Luftwaffe control rooms had scrambled hundreds of interceptors. Analysts believed up to 300 German fighters, Bf-109s, Bf-110s, FW-190s, would hit the bomber stream in coordinated waves. Each fighter carried between 500 and 900 rounds of high-velocity cannon and machine gun ammunition. Multiply that by hundreds, and the sky's geometry began to tilt decisively against the bombers. And then the killer stat, closing velocity. A Messerschmitt approaching head-on combined its own 350-400 mph speed with the bomber's 150-160 mph. Result? A closing velocity of nearly 600 mph. That gave Lou maybe 3 to 4 seconds to identify, track, and fire on an oncoming blur before it either tore into the formation or vanished behind the bombers to reset. At 600 mph, an enemy fighter covered 880 feet per second. The waist guns weren't even meant for frontal angles, yet the Luftwaffe's shift in 1943 forced them into that role. Now the dispersion math. A Browning M2 fired a cone of projectiles that widened with distance, roughly 6 to 7 feet of spread per 100 yards during burst fire. 2 guns, crossing unintentionally, could overlap their dispersion patterns into a deadly X in the sky. No manual taught this. No training film encouraged it. But the physics was undeniable. If 2 waist guns converged their fire at the same point, the probability of scoring hits increased as much as 36%, more in combat conditions where fighters sliced through the arcs quickly. But gunners were forbidden to cross arcs. Forbidden because friendly fire risked hitting their own formation, because coordination required discipline, because doctrine favored neat geometry over chaotic improvisation. Yet the Luftwaffe didn't care about doctrinal geometry. They cared about punching through the formation's seams. Their frontal attacks created a wedge where the nose guns, top turret, and waists all had to coordinate perfectly, something the human brain simply couldn't do in a 3-second window. Then the final brutal number, oxygen deprivation. At 25,000 feet, Lou's cognitive slowdown reached nearly 18%. Enough to throw timing off by half a second. Half a second in a frontal attack was the difference between firing and freezing, so the math of destruction tightened around him. Not courage, but calculus. Not training, but velocity. Not doctrine, but angles. Lou didn't know these numbers consciously, but he felt them. Every instinct in his 19-year-old body screaming against the thin logic of the manuals. And in the next minutes, when the sky tore open and fighters slashed into the formation, he would make a move that violated everything he had been taught and aligned perfectly with the physics no instructor had ever explained. Numbers end illusions. And this sky, this cold, blue, merciless sky, was about to end several at once. At 0704 on October 14, 1943, the Schweinfurt raid stopped being a mission and became a storm. Not a metaphorical one. An actual converging storm of fighters, cannon fire, wind blast, and screaming aluminum. The B-17 formation bucked like an iron spine being hammered in mid-air. Lou Halperin, 19 years old, clutching a waist gun he'd barely trained on, felt the fuselage twist under his boots, as if the aircraft itself were bracing for impact. The first German fighters came in high and head-on, just as the briefings warned, thin, dark needles hurtling straight toward the bomber stream. The nose guns and top turret opened up immediately, their tracers forming bright orange ladders in the air. But the Germans didn't hold the angle. They pivoted. The lead Bf-110 rolled right, peeling into a shallow diagonal attack that slipped under the nose gun's field, over the top turret's reach, and straight toward the waist sector that Lou was never supposed to swing upward toward. Lou froze. Training told him not to fire. Not your arc, rookie, stay disciplined. But training evaporated the moment he saw twin flashes under the fighter's wings. 20mm cannons. They flickered like lightning bugs in a storm. Then the shells came. The first explosion hit the fuselage just ahead of Lou's position, punching a fist-sized hole through the aluminum and spraying the inside of the bomber with fragments that rang off metal and tore through the insulation. The second round detonated in the radio compartment, the shock waves slamming Lou sideways against the gun mount hard enough to bruise his ribs. The intercom screamed with overlapping voices. "Radio hit! We've got fire! Incoming! Two more! Two more!" Then everything collapsed into a single, terrible moment of instinct. Lou saw movement. A second Bf-110 sliding into the same angle as the first, using the exact blind spot nobody in training had ever mentioned. It was coming too fast, too low, too diagonal. Not a rear quarter attack, not a broadside, not a head-on, a shallow descending rake that cut right across the seam separating the left and right waist arcs. It wasn't supposed to happen. The manual had no picture for this angle, no diagram, no guidance. Just blank space where death now lived. Lou swung his gun anyway. It wasn't a decision. It wasn't courage. It wasn't defiance. It was pure, panicked survival. He hauled the Browning across the forbidden boundary line, cutting straight into the opposite waist gunner's arc. A violation so severe that men had been thrown out of training for less. He squeezed the trigger. The Browning roared, the barrels vibrating against his palms, the 50 cal rounds stitching a rising curve of fire into the sky. The tracers weren't neat. They wobbled, dispersed, spiraled slightly as turbulence and adrenaline ruined his aim. But something in the chaos lined up perfectly with something in the physics. At the very same moment, the right waist gunner, veteran Staff Sergeant Crowley, saw the same fighter and swung his gun slightly past his arc. Two forbidden actions. Two converging arcs. Two cones of 50 cal fire stitching the same point in the sky. The fighter flew straight into the intersection. The result wasn't gradual. It wasn't cinematic. It was instant. Lou didn't see the cockpit shatter or the pilot slump. He saw the entire Bf-110 twitch unnaturally, like a puppet hit by a hammer, then flip hard to port, flames erupting from the right engine nacelle. A burst of smoke trailed back like a black scarf as the fighter disintegrated in midair. One wing sheared off, spinning away. The fuselage tumbled, then vanished behind the bomber stream. Crowley yelled, "Holy, did you see that? Halperin, what did you—" But the intercom drowned him out with shouts of, "He got it! The rookie got it! That angle shouldn't even be possible! What the hell was that crossfire?" Only Lou stood silent, shaking, staring at the spot where the fighter had been. He hadn't meant to cross arcs. He hadn't meant to invent anything. He had simply fired where fear pushed his hands. But the truth was undeniable. He and Crowley had created a lethal X pattern in the air, one no tactic manual had ever taught, and no instructor had ever demonstrated. The converging arcs multiplied their hit probability far beyond what either gun could achieve alone. A perfect accident, a perfect intersection, a perfect kill. It lasted 3 seconds. And it had just rewritten a small part of air warfare, by mistake, inside a freezing metal tube, 25,000 feet from home. At 0717 on October 14, 1943, the bomber formation reeled from the impact of the first wave. Smoke trails looped downward in loose spirals. A fortress 3 positions ahead bled fire from its wing root. Another wobbled, slid sideways, then dropped out of formation like a stone falling through cold glass. The sky wasn't just loud now. It was crowded with debris, shrapnel, and the ugly physics of too many aircraft in too little space. And inside his B-17, Lou Halperin felt the aftershock of what he had just done. A cross-arc burst that shattered a Luftwaffe fighter at a convergence point no manual even acknowledged. He didn't understand it, not yet. But the numbers were already reshaping themselves around him, collapsing into a pattern as ruthless as gravity. The Luftwaffe adjusted first. German pilots were trained to sniff weakness. They caught on faster than the Americans realized. The moment the first Bf-110 went down in that unnatural, violent snap roll, 2 Bf-109s peeled off from the second wave and dove toward the waist sector from the opposite side, as if probing the angles, testing the bomber's defenses, challenging the guns to repeat the impossible. Their movement was sharp, practiced, almost surgical. Paraphrased later from a captured pilot's log, the Americans fired strangely, crossed arcs, dangerous for them, but deadly for us if repeated. The math was shifting. Not slowly, not subtly, immediately. Lou felt it in the vibration of the fuselage as the second wave slashed in low. The angles were different now, tighter, more aggressive, cutting closer to the bomber's blind spots. German fighters weren't just attacking, they were reacting, altering geometry on the fly. The bomber's doctrine, static, rigid, memorized, couldn't keep up. Inside the waist compartment, Crowley's voice came ragged over the intercom. "Kid, what you did back there? Do it again if you see the angle. Don't wait for me." That sentence didn't belong in the bomber war. It wasn't discipline. It wasn't regulation. It was survival talking. The collapse of doctrine in real time. The second Bf-109 swept in fast, crossing a diagonal vector designed specifically to exploit the waist-nose boundary. Lou swung too early, realizing it only as his barrels lined up on empty sky. He corrected instinctively, muscles moving faster than conscious thought. The Browning spat another burst. Crowley did the same from the opposite side, and again their arcs brushed each other. Not perfectly, not cleanly, just enough to thicken the intersection of tracers. The 109 jinked to avoid the incoming fire. Wrong move. The evasive roll carried it straight through the crossing patterns. 3 rounds hit the fuselage. 1 tore through the engine cowling. Another cracked the canopy. The fighter didn't explode this time. It simply stumbled, dropped a wing, and spiraled away, trailing a thin gray plume. The hit probability had doubled not because either gunner shot better, but because their fields overlapped by accident. Overlap doubled density. Density doubled kills. Numbers end illusions. And now the Luftwaffe felt it. The third fighter in the attack wedge rolled over the top, clearly recalibrating. Its dive angle widened, avoiding the convergence zone entirely. Even the enemy understood the new threat. Their pilots were adjusting faster than the American doctrine allowed the bomber crews to respond. Lou didn't know the equations, but he felt the chain reaction inside the aircraft. The radio operator yelled that the intercom lines were flickering. Shock waves had loosened wiring. The tail gunner shouted that fighters were changing attack slants. The navigator warned their formation integrity was degrading, getting sloppy, spacing widening. The oxygen system sputtered, cutting Lou's airflow by just enough to blur his vision at the edges. Add those together and you get collapse math. Not emotional breakdown, geometric breakdown. A bomber formation depended on tight spacing. Tight spacing allowed tight field overlap. Tight field overlap saved lives, but damage, fear, and turbulence were tearing the formation apart by the minute. Lou squeezed the grips harder, his knuckles white beneath the gloves. He wasn't thinking about doctrine anymore. He was thinking about the way the tracers had crossed, how the fighter had died the instant it entered that woven sheet of fire. His mind replayed the pattern over and over like a heartbeat. A paraphrased line from a survivor's diary years later captured it perfectly. "We knew right then that the manuals were wrong. We knew we had been defending the sky with half of what our guns could do." The doctrine had cracked, the formation had cracked, and the Luftwaffe was coming again. Lou's mistake wasn't a mistake at all. It was an equation, and it was only beginning to solve itself. At 07:33 on October 14, 1943, with the sky over Schweinfurt dissolving into a tangle of smoke trails and falling aircraft, the bomber stream braced for the next coordinated wave. The Germans were regrouping. You could see it in the shifting contrails, lines that curled, reformed, then arrowed toward the formation like white scars across the blue. Even from the waist window, Lou could sense the choreography tightening. The Luftwaffe wasn't just attacking anymore. It was hunting with a precision edge sharpened by years of combat. But something else was changing too. Something inside Lou's aircraft. The crew had witnessed 2 kills from a firing geometry they weren't supposed to use. One the manuals insisted was reckless, dangerous, forbidden. Yet raw survival had already begun to burn the rulebook at the edges. You could hear it in the intercom chatter, clipped now, more urgent, more adaptive. "Crowley, watch my tracers. If I cross, you cross." "Copy. You see him dip, you swing. I'll swing with you. Pilot to crew, waist guns, coordinate if you have to, just keep them off us." That last line was sacrilege in 1943 bomber doctrine. Waist gunners weren't supposed to coordinate horizontally. They were slicers, not weavers. But the battlefield had changed. The German angles had changed. And the bomber's survival now depended on improvisation. Lou didn't fully grasp the shift. He just felt it. The feeling came as a low, grinding hum inside his ribs, a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and the cold certainty that something new was forming in the waist compartment, a method no one had taught but everyone now needed. The next attack wave confirmed it. 3 FW-190s in a tight, staggered formation coming from the southeast at a slashing upward angle. Not the usual dive, not the typical raking pass. This was a rising attack designed to slip under the top turret and between the ball turret's downward angle, an assault laser focused on the midsection where the waist guns lived. Lou saw the flash of sunlight off the lead fighter's canopy, then the shadow of its wings cutting across the bomber's flank like a blade. The 190s were climbing fast, closing faster. He swung left, Crowley swung right, both dodging the forbidden boundary line between arcs, until they didn't. The lead 190 rolled inverted, showing its belly for half a heartbeat before snapping upright. It was a maneuver that confused most gunners, but not this time. Lou tracked it, not by doctrine, not by calculation, but by instinct, now honed by 2 accidental victories. The moment the fighter rolled upright, Lou's barrels crossed just 2 degrees past his assigned arc. 2 degrees. Forbidden. Deadly. His tracers stitched upward at a diagonal, Crowley's stitched downward at the opposite angle. For half a second their fire overlapped, a lattice of red-orange streaks suspended in the air like a glowing wire frame. The FW-190 flew straight through it. The impact was immediate. The fighter shuddered violently, nose dropping as smoke burst from the engine cowling. A second burst of fire, Crowley's, ripped across the wing root. The 190 flipped, yawed, and then snapped into a spin so fast it looked like the sky had grabbed it and twisted it downward. "Hit! Jesus! Hit! Waist guns got him!" "That's 3-3 from the midsection. What the hell are they doing differently down there?" But the celebration was short. The second 190 in the trio closed from below, cannons flashing. The bomber jolted. One round punched through the fuselage near the radio compartment, another ripped fabric and insulation behind the ball turret. Lou didn't wait for orders. He pivoted hard, so hard the inertia shoved him against the fuselage rib, and fired a burst that lanced across Crowley's outflow. Again the angles overlapped. Again the cones intersected. A spark of bright metal tore free from the attacker's wing. Then a plume of fire. Then the 1-90 peeled away, trailing smoke. 2 kills in 10 seconds, both inside the forbidden zone. The third fighter aborted, rolled away, and climbed back into cloud cover. Even the Luftwaffe pilots understood something had shifted. A gap they had exploited for months had thickened into a thicket of intersecting fire. Inside the waste compartment, the crew knew it too. There was no cheering now. No jokes. Just a stunned silence. A 19-year-old rookie had just demonstrated twice the one thing bomber doctrine had insisted wasn't possible: coordinated lateral crossfire from the waste guns that created a high-probability kill zone. Later, historians would call it waste arc convergence. Engineers would call it dual-barrel intersect geometry. Pilots would call it whatever keeps us alive. But in that moment, inside the ripping wind and freezing aluminum of a B-17, it had only one name: survival. And survival spreads fast. At 11:12 on March 4, 1944, nearly 5 months after the hell of Schweinfurt, the sun climbed over the Adriatic in a hard, white glare, as a formation of B-24 liberators from the 15th Air Force churned east toward the Ploiești oil complex. Different bombers, different theater, different weather, but the same fear etched into the faces of every gunner inside every rattling fuselage. Ploiești didn't need introduction. Men whispered about it the way infantry whispered about Monte Cassino. It chewed up aircraft. It burned crews alive. It sent home wings full of holes and stories full of ash. But something invisible was flying with the B-24s that morning. Something that hadn't existed the last time they crossed this sky. A tactic born in the waste compartment of a freezing B-17 over Schweinfurt. A method that had spread not through official channels, but through rumor, field briefings, sideways advice from veteran gunners who said, "Look, don't ask why, but when he crosses that angle, you swing with your partner, not alone." A tactic that had crossed units, bases, landscapes, and aircraft models. Lou Halperin wasn't here. He was still flying out of England, his crew rotating through missions over the Ruhr. But his mistake, his accidental discovery, was here, stitched into the nervous jokes of the waste gunners, the reminders passed during pre-flight checks, the hurried chalk sketches made on the side of ammo crates. Waste arc convergence had become a quiet, unofficial doctrine. Inside B-24-44, 41068, waste gunner Private Joe Mancini tugged at the leather strap of his lucky Coca-Cola 5C bottle hanging from his gear. Superstitions traveled faster than tactics, but today the tactics mattered more. He was 19, too, a mirror of Lou in another aircraft, another front, and he had memorized the whispered instructions from a veteran who'd flown with the 8th Air Force months earlier. When your partner swings, don't freeze. Your fire isn't yours alone, it's part of a web. A web, not lines, not arcs, a web of fire. The first fighters rose from the Romanian countryside like black sparks thrown from a forge. FW-190s, BF-109s, even a cluster of Me-210s. They came fast, more aggressive than the Germans Lou had faced, because defending oil fields demanded it. The Liberator formation tightened instinctively. Engines droned in tense unison. Then it started. A lone FD-190 slashed up from below the left waist sector, cannons flickering. The bomber shuddered with the impact. One shell punched through the rear bomb bay, another tore a ragged hole in the vertical stabilizer. Mancini's partner, Corporal Reyes, swung first, but Mancini didn't wait for the old rule about arcs. He swung with him, sliding his barrels across the line they'd been warned about in training. Their tracers crossed into a rising diagonal. The fire laced upward, weaving in front of the incoming 190. The pilot realized the trap too late. A burst tore across his cowling, smoke belched. The fighter broke off, trailing a flutter of metal skins. 3 seconds, one instinctive weave, one plane gone. But the real test came 40 seconds later. a four-ship of Romanian IAR-80s, fast, light, maneuverable, closed from the starboard quarter. They attacked in a staggered ladder, each fighter using the slipstream of the one ahead to slingshot into firing range. The top turret couldn't depress far enough. The tail guns couldn't track fast enough. The waist guns had to carry the load. Reyes fired at the lead fighter, just as Mancini tracked the second. 2 angles, 2 targets, 1 overlap window. And then something happened that no manual could have predicted. The lead IAR-80 jinked left to avoid Reyes's fire, which moved it directly into Mancini's spillover tracers. It flew into the web. A puff of smoke, a burst of flame. The fighter curled downward like a burning leaf. The second IAR-80 continued the attack run. Mancini retracked, Reyes mirrored, and their tracers crossed in a thin, lethal X. The fighter plunged straight into the intersection. 2 kills in 20 seconds. A third fighter aborted its run entirely. The fourth climbed hard and away, pilot jolted by the unexpected density of defensive fire. Inside the Liberator, the crew stared at the waist guns like they were sorcery. "Did you see that? Waist guns just dropped 2, from opposite angles. What in God's name are they doing back there?" Mancini didn't answer. He couldn't. His hands were shaking, the realization washing through him like cold water. He hadn't defended his arc. He'd defended the formation. Reyes said quietly, "Kid, whatever this is, it works. Don't stop." And this was the truth the bombers now carried. They weren't firing lines anymore. They were weaving nets. Nets that multiplied probability. Nets that caught fighters in angles they didn't expect. Nets that changed the feel of the air war, one waist gunner at a time. In 10 minutes, the entire front shifted. Not because of new guns, not because of new armor, but because 19-year-olds thousands of miles apart had discovered the same truth. A bomber's deadliest weapon wasn't a single gun. It was cooperation across forbidden angles. The mistake that Halperin made in freezing blue, murderous sky had become a pattern. The pattern had become a tactic. The tactic was becoming a doctrine, quietly, invisibly, but unmistakably reshaping the war. At 09:58 on October 14, 1943, long after the worst of the Schweinfurt chaos had ripped through the bomber's stream, long after the contrails had twisted into a scarred lattice of smoke and falling debris, long after the B-17s had turned west with fewer aircraft than they'd arrived with, Halperin finally let go of the waist gun grips. For the first time in hours, the barrels were still. The cold in the fuselage felt heavier now. Not sharp, not violent, just heavy, like it had seeped deeper into the bones of the aircraft itself. The floor under Lou's boots was littered with empty brass, torn ammo belts, flakes of insulation blasted from the fuselage by near misses. 2 belts of 50 cal lay twisted in an accidental X-shape where turbulence had tossed them together. The symbol was almost too on the nose to be real. An X made of firepower. The geometry that had saved them. The geometry that didn't exist in the manuals. The intercom was quiet now, except for the pilot's strained breathing and the navigator calling corrections as they limped back toward England. The engines were still holding, though one sputtered every few minutes. The oxygen system flickered but survived. The waist compartment smelled of cold metal, gun oil, and the faint sweetness of burned insulation. It smelled like a place where doctrine had died, and something new had been born. Lou replayed the moment that started everything. The first forbidden swing, the first convergence of arcs. The perfect accidental intersection that tore a German fighter apart in a blink. He didn't feel pride, he didn't feel triumph. He felt something closer to confusion, even guilt. He had done something he wasn't supposed to do, something his instructors would have punished, something the manual explicitly warned against. And yet, the bomber was still flying. His crew was still alive. And deep down, beneath all the noise and fear, he knew the truth. They didn't survive because of the manual. They survived because he broke it. Coffin nail clarity hit him harder than recoil. They didn't win through more guns. but through smarter geometry. Not by firing first, but by firing together at angles no one had considered. Not through discipline alone, but through adaptation under fire. Numbers and illusions. And the illusion that bomber defense was fixed, static, unchanging, shattered today. In the debriefings that followed Schweinfurt, officers quietly noted an oddity. Several bombers reported kills from waste sectors that should have been impossible. Converging arcs, higher hit ratios, broken enemy attack runs. Some analysts dismissed it as luck. Others filed it under field improvisation. But one colonel, a veteran of earlier air campaigns, wrote a paraphrased line in a margin that would survive in the archives. Waste guns in coordination show enhanced lethality. Investigate geometry. Potential doctrine revision. That was the bureaucratic version of what every surviving waste gunner already knew in his bones. Lou had not just defended a bomber. He had reshaped a tactic. Not intentionally, not heroically, but unavoidably, because the sky forced his hand. And that's the final truth of the verdict. Air warfare didn't change because a 19-year-old was trained well. It changed because a 19-year-old refused to die following a diagram. Somewhere above the North Sea, as the clouds parted and the gray water below rolled past like a cold, endless plain, Lou looked down at the X of empty belts near his feet. 2 strips of metal, crossed by turbulence, mirroring what he'd done, the accidental symbol of a new pattern. A pattern that would outlast him. A pattern that had already saved hundreds of lives. War creates many things through brute force, but sometimes, rarely, it creates a breakthrough through a single moment of fear-threaded instinct. A rookie's error, a veteran's echo, and the birth of a tactic no one planned. The bomber crossed the English coastline at 13:07, limping but alive. A wounded steel cathedral carrying 10 exhausted men who were too drained to celebrate and too stunned to sleep. Lou Halperin stood in the waste compartment long after the wheels kissed the runway at Thorpe Abbotts. He didn't move until the engines finally shut down and the long, trembling silence of survival settled inside the fuselage. No one congratulated him. No one saluted him. No one declared him the inventor of anything. They simply walked off the aircraft in that quiet, shell-shocked way crews do when they realize their stories won't be believed by anyone but each other. But as Lou stepped onto the wet concrete, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. Some innovations in war begin in factories. Some begin in laboratories. But the most important ones begin with 19-year-olds who refuse to die by the book. Lou's mistake would never appear in the official mission summary. It wouldn't be typed on the daily operations sheet or diagrammed in any training pamphlet that month. But it traveled anyway. It traveled through whispers in briefing rooms, through hand signals between waste gunners, through chalk scribbles on bomb crates, through sergeants muttering, "If your partner swings, you swing." It traveled faster than doctrine, faster than paperwork, faster than fear. A web of fire born from panic, hardened into steel. By summer of 1944, waste arc convergence was no longer an accident. It was a field expectation. And long after Lou finished his tour, rotated home and returned to a world where grocery stores and sidewalks felt unreal, bomber gunners in 2 theaters would still be using his discovery, without knowing his name, without knowing the moment that started everything. That's why we tell these stories. Because history forgets the quiet breakthroughs, the terrified decisions, the split-second instincts that ripple outward and save lives no statistic can measure. Because somewhere in the archives, buried under pristine diagrams and tidy summaries, there are the truths that never got written down. If this story moved you, if Lou Halperin's accidental invention gave you a new glimpse into what WW2 really felt like, do one thing for us. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm this history matters. It helps us pull more forgotten stories out of the dark. Subscribe if you haven't already. We're telling these tales every week. Tales buried under dust and silence. Stories of courage, error, and ingenuity that shaped the war in ways even the men who lived them didn't fully understand. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Tell us who in your family served. Tell us which forgotten corner of WW2 you want us to explore next. You're not just a viewer. You're the one keeping these memories alive.